So, hello and welcome back yet again to another evening with Mr. Charles Dickens, who is. We're finally getting some action. It sounds like the French Revolution has started. I'm still not 100,000% sure how London and Paris are tied together. It could just be me being stupid. That has happened before in my life, but other than the fact that obviously the Manettes and Charles Darnay are from France, it's not like they're over there stirring the pot. I'm kind of picking up that maybe Dr. Manette was involved in some sort of like rebel group. Maybe that's why he went to prison. Basically, I want more details. Also, I don't know if I expressed it in the last video, but I really the whole chunks of time passing, I know that that's something that authors do quite a bit, and I just feel like it could have been handled better. Or maybe I'm just being really hard on this book because it's good. There is a story here. It just feels buried. So, but I am nothing if not stubborn, and we are going to finish this book. In fact, by midweek, we should be at the start of book 3. So that'll be exciting. We get to start chapter numbers over again. Anyway, with all of that being said, and me babbling and babbling and babbling, it is time to read chapter 22 in Book 2, The Golden Thread of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, and chapter 22 is titled The Sea Still Rises. Haggard Saint Antoine had only one exultant week in which to soften his modicum of hard and bitter bread to such extent as he could, with the relish of fraternal embraces and congratulations, when Madame Defarge sat at her counter, as usual, presiding over the customers. Madame Defarge wore no rose in her head, for the great brotherhood of spies had become, even in one short week, extremely chary of trusting themselves to the saint's mercies. The lamps across his streets had portentously elastic swing with them. Madame Defarge, with her arms folded, sat in the morning light and heat, contemplating the wine shop and the street. In both, there were several knots of loungers, squalid and miserable, but now with a manifest sense of power enthroned in their distress. The raggedest nightcap, awry on the wretchedest head, had this crooked significance in it. I know how hard it has grown for me, the wearer of this, to support life in myself. But do you know how easy it has grown for me, the wearer of this, to destroy the life in you? Every lean, bare arm that had been without work before had this work always ready for it now that it could strike. The fingers of the knitting women were vicious, with the experience that they could tear. There was a change in the appearance of Saint Antoine. The image had been hammering into this for hundreds of years, and the last finishing blows had told mightily upon its expression. Madame Defarge sat observing it with such suppressed approval as was to be desired in the leader of the Saint Antoine women. One of her sisterhood knitted beside her. The short, rather plump wife of a starved grocer and the mother of 2 children withal, this lieutenant had already earned the complimentary name of the Vengeance. "Hark!" said the Vengeance. "Listen, then. Who comes?" as if a train of powder laid from the outermost bound of the Saint Antoine quarter to the wine shop door had been suddenly fired, a fast-spreading murmur came rushing. "It is Defarge," said Madame. "Silence, patriots!" Defarge came in breathless, pulled off a red cap he wore, and looked around him. "Listen everywhere," said Madame again. "Listen to him." Defarge stood, panting against a background of eager eyes and open mouth formed up outside the door. All those within the wine shop sprang to their feet. "Say then, my husband, what is it?" "News! News from the other world." "How then?" said Madame contemptuously. "The other world?" "Does everybody here recall old Foulon, who told the famished people that they might eat grass, and who died and went to hell?" "Everyone," said everyone. "The news is of him. He is among us." "Among us?" cried the crowd again. "And dead?" "Not dead. He feared us so much, and with good reason, that he caused himself to be represented as dead, and had a grand mock funeral. But they have found him alive, hiding in the country, and have brought him in. I have seen him but now, on his way to the Hotel de Ville, a prisoner. I have said that he had reason to fear us. But I ask you all, did he have reason?" Wretched old sinner of more than 80 years, if he had never known it yet, he would have known it in his heart of hearts if he could have heard the answering cry. A moment of profound silence followed. Defarge and his wife looked steadfastly at one another. The Vengeance stooped, and the jar of the drum was heard as she moved it at her feet behind the counter. "Patriots!" cried Defarge. "Are we ready?" Instantly, Madame Defarge's knife was in her girdle, and the drum was beating in the streets as if it had a drummer and had flown together by magic, and the Vengeance, uttering terrifying shrieks and flinging her arms about her head like all the 40 Furies at once, was tearing from house to house, rousing the women. The men were terrible, in the bloody-minded anger with which they had looked down from the windows, and they caught up what arms they had and came pouring into the streets. But the women were a sight to chill the boldest. From such household occupations as their bare poverty yielded, from their children, from their aged and their sick crouching on the bare ground, famished and naked, they ran out with streaming hair, urging one another and themselves to madness with the wildest cries and actions. "Villain Foulon taken, my sister! Old Foulon taken, my mother! Miscreant Foulon taken, my daughter!" Then a score of others ran into the midst of these, beating their breasts, tearing their hair, and screaming, "Foulon alive! Foulon who told the starving people they might eat grass! Foulon who told my old father that he might eat grass when I had no bread to give him! Foulon who told my baby it might suck grass when my breasts were dry from want! O Mother of God, Foulon! O Heaven, for our suffering! Hear me, my dead baby and my withered father! I swear on my knees, on these stones, to avenge you upon Foulon. Husbands and brothers and young men, give us the blood of Foulon. Give us the head of Foulon. Give us the heart, body, and soul of Foulon. Rend Foulon to pieces and dig him into the ground that grass may grow from him." And with these cries, numbers of the women, lashed into a blind frenzy, whirled about, striking and tearing at their own friends till they dropped in a passionate swoon. and they were only saved by the men belonging to them from being trampled underfoot. Nevertheless, not a moment was lost, not one. This Foulon was at the Hotel de Ville and might be loosed. Never if Saint Antoine knew his own sufferings, insults, and wrongs. Armed men and women flocked out of the quarter so fast and drew even those last dregs after them with such a force of suction that within a quarter of an hour there was not a human creature in Saint Antoine's bosom but a few old crones and the wailing children. No. They were all by that time choking the hall of examination where this old man, ugly and wicked, was, and they were also overflowing into the adjacent open space and streets. The Defarges, husband and wife, the Vengeance, and Jacques Three were the first in, and at no great distance away from Foulon in the hall. "See!" cried Madame, pointing with her knife. "See the old villain, bound with ropes! That was well done to tie a bunch of grass upon his back. Ha! That was well done. Let him eat it now." Madame put her knife under her arm and clapped her hands as at a play. The people immediately behind Madame Defarge, explaining the cause of her satisfaction to those behind them, and those again explaining to others, and those to others, the neighboring streets resounded with the clapping of hands. Similarly, during 2 or 3 hours of the drawl and the winnowing of many bushels of words, Madame Defarge's frequent expressions of impatience were taken up with marvelous distance, at a distance the more readily because certain men, who had by some wonderful exercise of agility climbed up the external architecture to look in through the windows, they knew Madame Defarge well, and they acted as a telegraph between her and the crowd outside the building. At length the sun rose so high that it struck a kindly ray, as of hope or protection, directly down upon the old prisoner's head. The favor was too much to bear. An instant the barrier of dust and chaff that had stood surprisingly long went to the winds, and Saint Antoine had gotten him. It was known directly, to the furthest confines of the crowd. Defarge had but sprang over a railing and table, and folded the miserable wretch into a deadly embrace. Madame Defarge had followed and turned her hand in one of the ropes with which he was tied. The Vengeance and Jacques Three were not yet with them, and the men at the windows had not yet swooped into the hall like birds of prey from their perches, when the cry seemed to go up from all over the city, "Bring him out! Bring him to the lamp!" Down and up, the head foremost on the steps of the building, now on his knees, now on his feet, now on his back, dragged and struck at, stifled by the bunches of grass and straw that were thrown into his face by hundreds of hands, torn, bruised, panting, bleeding, yet always entreating and beseeching for mercy, now full of vehement agony of action, with a small clear space around him as the people drew one another back that they might see. Now a log of dead wood drawn through a forest of legs, he was hauled to the nearest street corner where one of the fatal lamps swung, and there Madame Defarge let him go, as a cat might have done to a mouse, and silently and composedly looked at him while they made ready, and while he besought her, the women passionately screeching at him the whole time, and the men sternly calling out to have him killed with grass in his mouth. Once he went aloft, and the rope broke, and they caught him shrieking. Twice he went aloft, and the rope broke, and they caught him shrieking. Then the rope was merciful and held him, and his head was soon upon a pike, with grass enough in the mouth for all of Saint Antoine to dance at the sight of. Nor was that the end of the day's bad work. For Saint Antoine so shouted and danced his angry blood up that it boiled again on hearing, when the day closed, that the son-in-law of the dispatched and another of the people's enemies and insulters was coming to Paris, under a guard of 500 strong, just in cavalry. Saint Antoine wrote his crimes on flaring sheets of paper, seized him, would have torn him out of the breast of an army to bear Foulon company, set his head and his heart on pikes, and carried the 3 spoils of the day in a wolf procession through the streets. Not before dark night did the men and women come back to the children who were wailing and breadless. Then the miserable bakers' shops were beset by long files of them, patiently waiting to buy bad bread. And while they waited, with stomachs faint and empty, they beguiled the time by embracing one another in the triumphs of the day and achieving them again in gossip. Gradually, these strings of ragged people shortened and frayed away. Then the poor lights began to shine high in the windows, and slender fires were made in the streets, at which neighbors cooked in common, afterwards supping at their door. Scanty and insufficient suppers those, and innocent of meat as of most other sauce to wretched bread. Yet human fellowship infused some nourishment into the flinty viands, and struck some sparks of cheerfulness from them. Fathers and mothers, who had their full share in the worst of the day, played gently with their meager children, and lovers, with such a world around them and before them, still loved and hoped. It was almost morning when the Defarges' wine shop parted with its last knot of customers, and Monsieur Defarge said to the madam, his wife, in a husky voice while fastening the door, "At last. It has come, my dear." Well," said Madame, "almost." Saint Antoine slept. The Defarges slept. Even the Vengeance slept with her starved grocer, and the drum was at rest. The drum's was the only voice in Saint Antoine that blood and hurry had not changed. The Vengeance, as a custodian of the drum, could have wakened him up and had some speech out of him, as before the Bastille fell, or before old Foulon was seized, but not with so hoarse tones of the men and women who were resting in Saint Antoine's bosom. And that is the end of the chapter. And I think that is where we're going to leave it tonight, because the next one is about the same length. And then we have one that looks a bit on the long side before we embark upon book 3. I don't know whether, speaking of revolution and war in sort of like metaphors and poetry, is to my taste. It is poetic, though. I will definitely give it that. It's so funny because you talk to people, and some people find Charles Dickens and his writing super relatable. Like, I've seen people who are like, he's the best author of the Victorian era, etc. And maybe he was, but I don't know that he is necessarily to my taste. Give me Jules Verne. Guess that just shows I am definitely one of the commoners and not one of the high-class people that this was written for. Anyway, thank you as always for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that rather bloody chapter with people's heads on pikes and things like that. Do leave me a thumbs up if you don't mind. It does always make me smile, and I will see you tomorrow.